I want to thank the Research Center for the History of Transformations for having me as associated researcher. It's an honor and a pleasure. And also, I want to thank Reset also for inviting for setting up this fellowship for Ukrainian scholars who are unable at the moment to continue their research in Ukraine. And I want to tell you that my presentation, it's called Putin, Russia, and the European far right. It seems that there is no Ukraine. Apparently, there is no Ukraine in the title, and why it is part of the program. But it is actually very much connected to Ukraine, and not only because Putin, Russia is attacking Ukraine, but also much of what is happening and much of what is the essence of the cooperation between Putin, Russia, and the European far right is focused on Ukraine. And I must tell you that this research, which resulted in a book in 2017, I'm now working on the second edition. The publishers invited me to do a second edition of the book. It's also ongoing research. But it started, although I had this history, history of looking at the far right, European far right, but also looking at Russian politics. This research, I think, this aha moment was in 2014 on the 16th of March, when there was a so-called referendum on the annexation of Crimea. And the essence of my future research, that what I'm now talking about, was, I think, crystallized in this very picture. This is a picture that you will see this 16th of March in Crimea, I think it's in Prague. And you see so-called observers of this sham referendum that was followed immediately by the annexation, by the illegal annexation of Crimea. And you will see some of these people, and probably it will not give you much information just by looking at them, but mostly what you see here, these people are coming from, the majority of them are coming from the far right political corners of Europe, the majority of them. There are some people who, there is a woman here, Tatiana Zhdanov, she's coming from a pro-Russian party in Latvia, which is not far right, it's more of a centrist, but still very much pro-Russian. The bald guy in the center, he's also not the far right, he's a member of the Communist Party of Greece, but all the others, sorry, no, I mistaken. It was this bald guy, he's coming from the left-wing party in Germany, Die Linke. But all the others, majority, are coming from the far right. And when I saw that picture in Crimea, where I am originally from, I thought, what's happening? Why are these people there? Why they're called observers? Why they're coming predominantly from the far right? So what's happening? Why? So this question, why, led me to do this research on the relations between Russia and the far right. And as you may imagine, this research, it also offers maybe two perspectives. One perspective is looking at the subject from the European far right perspective, or from the perspective of the development of the European far right, radical right-wing populist politics. And the other perspective is obviously looking at this from the Russian perspective. Why Russia would need these people to go to a referendum, why it would need a referendum in the first place. So these questions led to writing this book, and honestly, it all started just by looking at this very photograph. But I must tell you, when I started this research, I also had to go into history. When I started this, I was looking 2014, this referendum. So what was happening at the time? Then I had to go back. I had to go to the beginning of the 2000s. Then I had to go to the 90s, and then I had to go to the Cold War period, and then I had to go to the interwar period, looking at how actually the Russians or the Soviets actually cooperated with the European far right. It was not only the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, there was this whole field, the whole environment that was that had this involvement of on the far right and various Russian actors. But I will not go really far back in history. I just want to just show you some photographs and comment on them. Here you see Alexander Lukin, one of the Russian fascist ideologues, who's still alive, despite the fact that somebody wanted to kill him this summer. Instead of him, his daughter was killed in a blast a few weeks ago. But he started cooperating with different European far-right figures already at the end of the 1980s. So it was still the Soviet Union, but he already started this cooperation. And in the 90s, he was the figure who built all those contacts, who built all those networks. Then obviously you have Jean-Marie Le Pen, and Vladimir Putin, who died recently this spring. The far-right Russian far-right figure, who wanted to have good relations with the European far-right, and he would be inviting Jean-Marie Le Pen, who was at that time the leader of the National Front, the major French far-right party. One important aspect, so when we're looking at the 90s, when we're looking at the beginning of the 2000s, the far right, well, first I will tell you that there is this narrative that you can that you hear very often from the media, the rise of the far right. You know, all the newspapers, especially mainstream newspapers, especially left-wing leaning, would be talking about the rise of the far right. In fact, if we are looking at the evolution or the development of the far right, we will see that they are most likely, they are more often are used by more powerful actors for their own different aims and objectives. So internationally, the far right in the contemporary era, in the contemporary period, they're characterized by their ability to sell their services to different dictators. And I will explain to you what it means. So this is Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein. And he would, so the first picture, you will see Hussein together with Vladimir Putin. And on the second picture, the Austrians among you will definitely recognize the former leader of the Freedom Party of Austria. And again, Saddam Hussein. So why these far-right figures, the Russian one and the Austrian one, why would they have anything to do with Saddam Hussein? The thing is, as I said, far-right figures would often do some services for dictators. So Vladimir Zhirinovsky, for example, he was very useful for Saddam Hussein because when the UN, when there were international sanctions imposed on the Iraqi regime, there was, some of you will remember the program, food in exchange, oil for food. So the idea was that the Iraqis could not sell their oil and get money, but they would only have these vouchers that they could exchange for food. Yeah, that was in the basic explanation. That was it. So it was food for oil. There was a UN program. So what Zhirinovsky would do, he would help Saddam Hussein to sell those vouchers, not to get food for them, but actual money that the regime would use in order to sustain itself. That was one of the schemes to circumvent the international sanctions. And Zhirinovsky was responsible for one of those circumvention projects. Obviously, he was not acting on his own. He was part of the Russian help, Russian assistance to circumvent the sanctions for Iraq. And off topic, but now we see a very similar story. Now, actually, Iran is helping Russia to circumvent the Western sanctions. So there is this, it's a different topic, and I think it's very interesting. Maybe some of you will be interested in this. This whole area of different rogue regimes and authoritarian regimes helping each other to circumvent sanctions that are imposed on them. the Austrian far right helped Saddam Hussein in a different way. They basically they somehow they convinced Saddam Hussein that if the Freedom Party of Austria will come to power, they will lift the sanctions imposed on Iran. It was obviously it was boasting. It had nothing to do with the reality. Austria would not be able to lift the sanction even if the far right came to power. It's just impossible. But they managed to sell this idea to Saddam Hussein in exchange for money. So this is just one example of how the story about the sanctions and the cooperation of the far right with the authoritarian leaders, how it actually develops and how it has a history. Yeah? So what I'm saying that it all started in the 90s. Obviously, there was a previous history, but let's take the 90s. But from the Russian side, yeah, we had Dugin and Zhirinovsky and Sergei Glaziev and some other people. But it all was quite, from the Russian side, it was all very marginal. Yeah? It was on the fringes of politics. It was never important at that time. It was never important for the regime, for the authorities themselves. Why? Because, well, under Yeltsin, obviously, Yeltsin posed as a Russian Democrat, that he managed to convince the West that he was building a democracy in Russia. Also, during the first presidential term of Vladimir Putin, there was this honeymoon with the West. Russia was part of G8, and everybody was shaking hands with Putin. So it was a real honeymoon, you know. You probably remember George Bush Jr. He looked in the eye of Vladimir Putin and he saw a soul there. So it was this very nice period of relations between Russia and the West. Zhirinovsky, during the first presidential term of Putin, actually came up with the idea that it would be useful for Russia to cooperate with the far right. And you need to remember what time was it? Yeah, it was 2003. Some of you will remember that Jean-Marie Le Pen, the leader of the National Front, he made it to the second round of the presidential elections in France. By that time, yeah. So there was this wow effect. So there was this idea, or maybe the far right actually are a new rising power. Zhirinovsky himself was quite successful, and by that time, by 2003, also the Freedom Party of Austria, led by Jörg Haider, who you see here in the picture with Saddam Hussein, they had a coalition government with the Conservatives, with the People's Party of Austria. So there was this strange feeling that the far right may be on the rise in terms of maybe are they coming to power. And Zhirinovsky had this idea, so why not cooperate with the far right? I think here is a quote that was a very successful time for Zhirinovsky and his party, which is ironically called Liberal Democratic Party of Russia, but it has nothing to do with liberal democracy or liberalism or democracy. But he had this idea, so why not cooperate with the far right? And something that you see here in bold, he said, that was a very short article. He said, I believe that today Moscow, through the workings of the First World Congress of Patriotic Parties, could have leverage on the world politics in the interest of all people on the planet. So these Congress of the Patriotic Parties, in quotation marks, that was basically a Congress that Zhirinovsky organized, where the majority of the parties from Europe were from the far right. So they were ultra-nationalist parties, including the Freedom Party of Austria. So what I will be talking about, I will briefly talk about these several stages, several stages of how the relation between the far right and Putin's Russia developed. They all started with fake election observation, something that I referred to in the beginning of my presentation. And you saw that picture from Crimea. And looking deeper in the developments, I realized obviously that was not just something new in 2013. These fake election observation had a real history. The second stage is media engagement. will be especially brief at this point because there will be a special presentation on RT and the media in November, as Irena already said. The third stage is political support. It's a much higher status of these relations. And then cross-party cooperation. And then I will, if I still have time, I hope I will concentrate on the Austrian case, because we are in Austria, and it will be especially useful for Ukrainian scholars who came here to actually see what is happening in some pockets of the Austrian politics concerning Russia and concerning this whole situation that we find ourselves in. So, as I said, the first stage is fake election observation. It has nothing to do actually with real election observation. It's essentially political activity performed by international actors. They aimed at advancing interests of politicians and political forces by imitating credible election monitoring during electoral processes. You can see a list of why these fake observers are needed in the first place. But just to give you some examples, it has become a practice since the 90s, since the fall of the Soviet Union, to invite election observers. Yeah, that was part of the process of democratization. Yeah? We need to see how you hold your elections, whether they're fair, whether they're democratic, whether they're open, whether they're pluralistic. We need to see it. And in exchange, if you're doing all this well, we'll give you funds for further democratization and modernization of your country. So that has become this real practice to invite election observers. But authoritarian leaders, they actually realized that, well, of course, they want to retain power. And of course, they try to manipulate elections. But still, they still need to invite those observers. Yeah? And especially the OSCE observers from this established organization. Otherwise, if you don't invite them, then it means that you're authoritarian leader. So you don't. But everybody wants to be democratic, or at least look democratic. So they need to invite them. But they invented another thing. They also invented fake observation. So they would invite friendly people, friendly politicians who would come to our country and say that everything is fine. And then we can say, yes, so these observers from the OSCE, maybe they're biased, they didn't like them, but other international observers, some other European politicians, see that it's totally fine, it's all good, and when you relativize these results, you create a very distorted picture of what is going on. And Russia and Azerbaijan and some other countries and also unrecognized territories such as Abkhazia and South Ossetia, Transnistria, had this thing. They would invite these fake observers. And here is a quote which I find especially funny, coming from Nick Griffin, who was a leader of the neo-fascist British National Party, and he observed again elections in Russia and also Ukraine, 2011, 2012, and he would come back to the UK and write, "I was stunned to discover a robust, transparent, and properly democratic system that made me even more aware than ever of the truly shocking failings of the archaic and corrupted shambles that masquerade as free and fair elections in Great Britain." So they would invite these people, and especially the more on the fringes they were, the more radical and more extreme they were, the less they would care about actual democracy. Yeah? And they would obviously use this platform to criticize the democratic procedures in their own countries. Here you will see Joachim Denus, who in 2014 was one of the leading members of the Freedom Party of Austria. Again, this is from the so-called referendum in Crimea in March 2014. It's showing his certificate or confirming that he is an international observer. So that that was the first stage, and it all started around 2005, 2006. The involvement of far-right politicians, of ultra-nationalist politicians, non-democratic politicians who would be invited to assess the democratic nature or non-democratic nature of elections in the post-Soviet, especially in the post-Soviet space. Now we see the globalization of this process. Actually, if you follow for example, the Hungarian elections, it was in April, parliamentary elections in Hungary this year. It was the first time that a leader of EU country would invite fake observers in order to manipulate the actually different social interpretations of what was happening at the elections and before them. So it's a process that is being globalized at the moment, and probably especially if you follow the so-called sham referenda in Ukraine a few weeks ago, you would also see those fake observers who try to legitimize the processes which are otherwise illegitimate and illegal, I would say. Then there was this stage number 2 of the media, and as I said, I would be very brief here because there will be a separate presentation on this topic. In 2008, in August 2008, if some of you remember, there was a war between Russia and Georgia. It was only for 5 days. Russia won the war easily, but there was this feeling among the Russian experts close to the Kremlin and within the Kremlin itself that they could easily win the war, but they thought that they lost the information war. They thought that they failed to convince the West that the actions of the Russian Federation were somehow justified. And they decided to reform their media machine. And it was a very, very different period from what we have today. Now we can talk about global Russia. Now in 2013, we were shocked to discover that there is this huge disinformation machine run by the Russian authorities. In 2008, it was completely different. There was nothing. Russia had Russia Today, the TV channel, which was basically about how beautiful Russia is, or how great the Russian belly is, but it was not at all that propaganda machine that we know now. And that was the moment, 2008, August 2008, when they realized that they actually had no instruments to influence the public perceptions in the West about Russia and about what Russia was doing. And that was this turning point, 2008 and then 2009, when they decided to build this huge disinformation propaganda machine. And the idea was no longer that Russia was good. The idea was that the West is bad. And in order to show and in order to prove their own point that it was the West that was bad, they started inviting people from the fringes of the Western politics and societies, the far right, the far left, conspiracy theories, isolationists, all sorts of people who were themselves undermining, say, the liberal democratic consensus in the West, who were undermining and subverting, or at least they tried to undermine and subvert the transatlantic relations. People who were really skeptic about the European Union and the Eurozone and the Schengen area. So everybody who would be somehow providing arguments why the West was bad and why the West was failing. So 2008, 2009, that was the beginning of this cooperation with the far right. They were invited as experts to RT and other media channels. They were asked what they thought about international relations. So that was that was the beginning of this second stage of the cooperation. And of course, they were all running together. Yeah? Fake observation. It started in 2005, 2006, but it did not end. Yeah, they were all running in parallel stages. And then another stage was the cross-party cooperation. And yeah, we can also talk about political support, but just a little bit about cross-party cooperation. 2016, December, here you see the leader, at that time, the leader of the Freedom Party of Austria, again, the FPÖ, Heinz Christian Strache, together with Sergei Zheleznyak, who at that time was the person responsible for international contacts of the ruling party of Russia, which was Единая Россия, United Russia. And in December 2016, they signed an agreement on cooperation and collaboration. So the two parties would cooperate with each other. This agreement was pretty vague. The only reason actually why they signed it and United Russia was the side that decided to agree to the proposal of the FPÖ to have this agreement, is because at that time there was an election, presidential election in the second round of the presidential election in Austria, and the candidate from the FPÖ, from the Freedom Party of Austria, had a very good chance to be elected as president. And for the Russians, that would be a great opportunity to, well, to present this whole operation as something really beneficial for the Kremlin. The idea was that Norbert Hofer, who was the candidate from the Freedom Party of Austria at the presidential elections, and he would be coming from the party that had cooperation agreement with the Russian party. So it was this very strange idea of using this presidential election. But as we will see, as I will show you, I think there was actually no substance in that cooperation agreement, and it led to really nothing. But there was another party who wanted to have the same agreement with the United Russia, with the Единая Россия, and that is the party of Matteo Salvini, the leader of the Lega Nord, the Northern League, or just the League, an Italian far-right party. Just a few months after the Austrians signed the agreement, the Italians also have the same agreement with Sergei Zheleznyak, with the United Russia. What's interesting is that it was the same agreement. It was word for word, with one exception, one small exception. It was the same agreement, which means that none of these people, not an Austrian party, not the Italian party, had actual say on what would be written in that agreement. That was the project of the Russians, and the Russians would just, here's the agreement, sign it. Yeah? There was no discussion, no national peculiarities would be discussed. No, it was just this move. Here's the agreement. You want it, here you are. Yeah? You can't contribute to the discussion about the content of that agreement. But again, I must tell you that it was more that symbolical gesture, symbolical move to have this agreement. It actually changed nothing. And so that was cross-party cooperation, which I believe was a non-starter, but it was very important symbolically. It was also important for the Western audiences, for the European audiences in particular, to actually see that the Kremlin was cooperating with the far right, and it would usually mean that the Kremlin would be supporting the forces that try to undermine the European Union. So that was a very clear message. Another message was in March 2017, when Marine Le Pen, who at that time replaced her father, Jean-Marie Le Pen, as the leader of the National Front, the major French far-right party. And in March 2017, she went to Moscow to meet with some Russian officials, including President Vladimir Putin. And it was not just some accidental visit to Moscow. Far from it. It was just 1 month before the presidential elections in France. Just 1 month before that, and she would go to Moscow and she would be received by Putin, and that was a very clear message that Le Pen was the candidate of the Kremlin in the French presidential elections. There was history, obviously, of this meeting. There was a bank loan of 9 million euros that the National Front would receive from a Russian bank back in 2014 for the original elections in France. There was very turbulent relationship between Le Pen's party and various Russian actors, but it was not only positive; it was also quite problematic for the French far right. But still, there was this meeting, and there was a very clear message who was the preferred candidate of the Kremlin in those elections. Not Emmanuel Macron, not the centrist candidate, but a candidate coming from the ultra-nationalist wing of French politics. And now I want to go back to the Austrian case and explore a little bit this particular area and this particular region. When I said that the Russians agreed to the proposal of the Freedom Party of Austria to sign this agreement, the thing is that the Jochen Gudenus and Heinz-Christian Strache, they wanted to have good relations with Moscow for a very long time. It did not start in 2016 when they signed this agreement. It did not start in 2014 when Jochen Gudenus went to Crimea to observe that sham referendum. It all started in around 2007, 2008. And already then, the FPÖ, the Freedom Party of Austria, started networking, started building contacts with various Russian actors. They wanted something. They wanted to have good cooperation for whatever reason. They would be going to Moscow. They would be going to Chechnya to see Kadyrov, for example. The official explanation of the FPÖ's visit to Kadyrov was that they wanted to see whether it was safe in Chechnya, because some of you may know that Austria received the majority of Chechen refugees after both Chechen wars. After the first one and the second one, Austria became the place where Chechen refugees would go. So the FPÖ, as an anti-immigrant party somehow, they wanted to see maybe Chechens could go back to Chechnya if it was safe. Obviously, Kadyrov explained to them that it's totally safe to go back to Chechnya, but that was the official part of the story. There was another part of the story that they would also discuss probably some business opportunities from which both sides could somehow benefit. Of course, this is the informal part of the story. But anyway, this shows that the FPÖ was somehow interested in working with the Russians. They would meet with the heads of Moscow, of the Moscow region. They would discuss again business opportunities. So it was not only political it was not only political aspect that was part of all these relationships. There was also an economic aspect. Then they signed this agreement in 2016. So basically 8 years after the FPÖ started wooing the Kremlin. But then in 2017, what happened is that in the Austrian parliamentary elections, the Freedom Party of Austria, the FPÖ, were quite successful. They received a very strong support from the Austrian electorate, and they formed a coalition government with the People's Party of Austria, with the center-right, with the Conservative Party. And many people were afraid, were concerned about these contacts between the FPÖ and Russia. And when the government, the coalition government was discussed, when the ministerial posts were discussed. President Alexander Van der Bellen, was recently re-elected as Austrian president. He had some important influence on the process of these negotiations back in 2017. And although the Freedom Party of Austria would have control over foreign ministry and defense ministry, especially with foreign affairs, especially with the international relations, Van der Bellen and also the Conservative Party, they decided to somehow limit the influence of the FPÖ on international politics, on international relations, foreign policy of Austria. And the candidate for a foreign minister was coming from the side of the FPÖ, Karin Kneißl, but she herself was not a member of the FPÖ. So there was some sort of a distance between the party, between the far right and the foreign minister, Karin Kneißl. So Van der Bellen and other important Austrian actors at that time decided to limit the influence of the FPÖ on foreign policy because of these very weird connections to the Russian Federation. And now I want to, so from 2017, when this government was formed that I mentioned, I want to go straight 2019 to May 2019. And what's interesting there is this. I think the people who spend some time in Austria already know what this picture means. For those of you who don't, this is a great story. So the guy on the left is Johann Gudenus, and the guy on the right is Heinz-Christian Strache. So basically the leaders of the Freedom Party of Austria. And they are here on Ibiza, a small Spanish island in the Mediterranean. And this is 2017. This is the year 2017, just before the elections where the FPÖ had some very good electoral support. The woman whose face is blurred on the right presented herself to both of them as the niece of a Russian oligarch.
It's
Is it?
Yes,
is she?
You can't see.
Okay, yeah, you're right. Yeah, but you see still a hand on the left at the bottom of that woman. So yes, the woman on the right is the wife of Gudenus, but there was another woman who was present on that scene, and she was presented to them as the niece of a Russian oligarch, Oksana Makarova, I think her alleged name was. And they were discussing how this Russian oligarch and she, as a niece of the Russian oligarch, could help the FPÖ with the elections. And they were having lots of drinks, lots of vodka, lots of Red Bull energy drinks. It was a very informal conversation that they had. What they didn't know, neither Gudenus nor Strache, that it was all a setup. It was all just a sting operation in order to collect compromising materials from them. So there was no Russian oligarch's needs. That was, as far as we know, it was some student from Bosnia, maybe. So she was not Russian, she was not a niece of any oligarch. And all this place where they met on the Ibiza island, on that villa, was just full of hidden CCTV cameras that would film everything that they were doing. And the people who were behind this sting operation had around like 6 hours of video footage. First, they wanted to sell that footage, but probably blackmail someone. But in the end, what happened is that in May 2019, so basically 2 years after that meeting on Ibiza, a 6 minutes video was leaked to the press, and that created a huge scandal. And in result, because because they essentially discussed, in those 6 minutes, what we heard, they discussed how the Russians can help, how the oligarch can help the FPÖ, how the FPÖ would be, if they came to power, how they would try to limit the freedom of the press. So it was a huge scandal indeed, and the government, the coalition government, collapsed. Jochen Gudenus left the party with he quit all his positions that he had. Heinz Christian Strache also stepped down as the leader of the FPÖ. And that was the end of this coalition government. And I would argue that was also the end of the cooperation, of the at least high-ranking cooperation between the FPÖ and the Russians. But there is this period of time, 2017, 2019, 2 years when the FPÖ, when the Freedom Party of Austria was in the coalition government. Before the elections, Heinz Christian Strache would always say that we opposed the sanctions imposed on the Russian Federation. We would lift them, or at least we would try to lift them if we come to power. And they would always be arguing for more cooperation with the Russian Federation, etc., etc. The center-right party, who would become a major coalition partner for them in the government, the People's Party of Austria, led at that time by Sebastian Kurz, who would become a chancellor of Austria. He was also quite wobbly on the sanctions against Russia. So he would say, well, they don't really help. Probably we should introduce some sort of gradual lifting of the sanctions in exchange to some good steps by the Russian Federation in this conflict with Ukraine. So he was also not strict. He was not calling for more sanctions. Against Russia, it was the opposite. So, but when they started working as a government, Heinz-Christian Strache actually had to tone down his pro-Russian rhetoric and his rhetoric on the sanctions, because he had to behave. He was just a minor leader in that government. He would not be able to challenge the course of Austria. He would not be able to challenge the Austrian adherence to the EU consensus on the sanctions, so it was not possible. But still, Austria, under the rule of Kurz and Strache, who became vice chancellor, still they would give some, or at least they would do some steps, they would do some actions that were still beneficial to the Kremlin. One very important step was signing of the agreement to extend the energy supplies, gas supplies from Russia to Austria. It was not that there was no such agreement before. There was such an agreement, but it is to the benefit of the Russian Federation to have long-term agreements. And although during that time there was an agreement between Russia and Austria for gas supplies, the Russians would convince the Austrians, they would convince the government, this center-right, far-right government, to have a new agreement, a longer agreement. That was one of the aims of the Russian Federation in all these talks. Then we could mention some other symbolic elections that were important for the Kremlin, and I'm sure many of you will remember this photograph. This is Vladimir Putin on the left, just in case you don't know. And on the right is Karin Kneißl, that foreign minister suggested by the far right. She invited Vladimir Putin to her marriage that did not end well. Maybe that was the visit of Vladimir Putin maybe a reason for it in the end. And she would be dancing with Putin, and then she did this very strange ritual, in my opinion. But that picture also became really scandalous in Austria and in Europe. And actually, Sebastian Kurz, who was at that time still chancellor, Austria had to explain specifically to European allies, no, that doesn't really mean anything. That doesn't mean that Austria was submitting to Russia and became a slave to Russia. No. We are still standing by the EU consensus. We are still standing by the Western alliance. But there were other things that that Austrians under that government would do. For example, when it was time for the Western alliance and for Western partners to expel Russian diplomats as a response to the poisoning of the Skripals, Austria would not send back to Russia even a single Russian diplomat, even a single one. They would say, well, we are not part of NATO, we are neutral, so we are not doing anything. Yeah. So even Hungary, being so much controversially friendly towards Russia, even they would send at least one worker of the Russian embassy back to Russia. Austrians did not do anything like this. Also, the Austrian government would sort of play down all those scandals about espionage, Russian espionage in Vienna. Some of you may know that Vienna is considered to be the capital of espionage because of international organizations that are located here, like the Atomic Agency, the OC. So they would play down all these scandals. So there was these symbolical things. But on the greater scale, like challenging the sanctions, it was a no-go. They would not be able to do this. Another explanation why probably hopes of the Kremlin that the coming to power or the rise to power of the far right would somehow be beneficial. Why those hopes were basically shattered is because of Trump. The thing is that Donald Trump, when he was president of the United States of America, he made the US quite appealing to the European far right. So if before Trump, the European far right would be saying, well, we are against liberalism, we are against the domination of the United States, we don't want to have United States in Europe, we want them to leave, we don't want to be dominated by the United States. Under Donald Trump, you could no longer say this because Donald Trump was considered like our guy. He was Trump's America was our America, well, from the perspective of the far right. So, and many in the FPÖ, many in the Austrian far right, they were huge fans of Donald Trump. Williamsby, one of the leading members of the FPÖ and also a member of the European Parliament from this party, he went in February 2017 to Washington, D.C. in order to take part in one of the conventions where Trump was speaking. So why it is important is because although many would say that Trump was quite friendly towards Russia, still in the mainstream discourse, in the sort of traditional discourse of the Kremlin, the US was still the enemy number one. But the FPÖ would not be able to support Russia, to support Moscow on that particular move. And even when Karin Kneissl would meet with Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister of the Russian Federation, when Lavrov would be attacking Brussels, attacking the used sanctions against Russia, and also attacking the Americans, the US, Karin Kneissl would not be able to support these rhetoric, to support these statements of Lavrov. So there was this limit how far the pro-Russian narratives, the pro-Russian discourse of the FPÖ could go. And I'm moving to the end of my presentation, how it all ended, at least a particular stage ended. As I said, Heinz-Christian Strache had to leave the leadership of the FPÖ because of this Ibiza scandal with that fake oligarchs, Russian oligarchs' knees. And what happened is that the FPÖ had this, what I call the pro-Russian faction within the party that was formed by Johan Budenus, by Strache himself, by some other people who were marginalized at around 2008, 2019. They became marginal, but that was the pro-Russian faction. Once the pro-Russian faction was out, either marginalized or just had to leave because of the scandal. There were no other people in the FPÖ who actually still push for this pro-Russian discourse. And the FPÖ embraced what I would describe the cynical version of neutralism. It's not a neutralism. It's not neutralism in its classical understanding. It's not neutralism, say, of Switzerland. It was a different type of neutralism, which meant that they would not be supportive of Russia or of Ukraine, but by having this position, they would still be automatically supporting Russia to a certain extent. But it would not be somehow expressed, openly for them. But also important, and this is how I think this story ended, at least at this point. I want to give you a quote, and I know that Irena said that everything would be in English, but it's a quote in German because I wanted to keep some of the original language of Herbert Kickl, who became the leader of the Freedom Party of Austria, of the FPÖ, and what he said, and I think this is actually quite important. So he said that he would be criticizing Strache for his connections to the Russians. He said that he didn't understand why it was very important for Strache and the FPÖ to have some context with the Balkans, with the Russians. And he would also say that, well, if we are a populist party, if we are a party of a little man, and this is the core of a populist discourse, if we want to defend the little man from the corrupt elite, why the hell would you, the leader of this party, would be going to Ibiza to hang out with the Russian oligarchs? So there was this, criticism of Strache, of his pro-Russian positions from the populist position within his party. And Herbert Kickl, his idea was that we don't need those international relations. We are an Austrian party. We are a party of Austrian patriots. We need to take care only about our own country. And that was his embrace of this strange version of neutralism, but still, it was that was, in my opinion, this for a moment, the end of this relationship. Although one final remark, and I will end my presentation. The funny thing is that when he said that, that was also the end of at least around that time, that was also the end of the agreement between the FPÖ and the United Russia. It was for 5 years. So they had this agreement. The signing of the agreement was in December 2016. So then the Ibiza scandal took place, and then in 2021, the agreement had to end, but it would only end, according to this agreement, if 6 months before that, the FPÖ would say, well, no, we don't want this agreement anymore. So when Kickl was asked whether you're going to extend the agreement, he said, no, there is no need for it. But the funny point is that the agreement will still be running, so they are still having this agreement in place because they did not want the other side of the end of this agreement. What this story shows us that all these relations, all these relationships, they are not. We can't say that they are only driven by ideological considerations. We cannot say that they are driven solely by the Kremlin's desire to undermine the liberal democratic consensus in Europe, or the transatlantic relations between EU and Europe in general and the United States of America. They're also driven by strange, sometimes accidental decisions of particular people. They are limited, these relations are limited from different sides. And it's all complex, and there are ups and downs, and we see that sometimes the far right are not very happy with Russia, with what they're doing, especially now after the 24th of February, after the renewal of the full-fledged invasion of Ukraine from the Russian Federation. We see that some forces are, even on the far right, are uneasy about continuing relations with the Russian Federation. We see that Le Pen was quite unambiguously criticizing Russia for what it was doing. We still see some forces on the far right who are still very much in partnership with the Russian Federation. It's mostly about the alternative for Germany. But for the FPÖ, for the Austrian case, we see that the formal relationship, or the open relationship, has ended, although being not supportive of the actions of the Austrian government that are still in line with the general EU consensus on the Russian Federation. The FPÖ automatically plays for the other side. It plays for the Kremlin, for Moscow, in its unjustified and criminal invasion of Ukraine. Here I will stop. I will be happy to answer questions if you have them, and thank you.